Great. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back. This is the third of our live stream plenaries, and welcome all those who are joining online. My name is Rachel Sabates-Wheeler, and I'm here, fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. That's for the sake of the online people, because I know you guys know that. And we have a really interesting session now, and I hope we're going to be able to counteract the carbohydrates that are sitting in your stomachs. So you can really stay engaged. But we're going to be looking at protecting the gains, how social protection can support livelihoods and growth in crises situations. So we're going to be focusing on livelihoods and growth, and a little bit more as well that we haven't really talked much about yet in this conference. So there's a number of challenges we've been talking about over the last 1.5 days, and we're all aware of the current global context in terms of shrinking aid budgets, also the high levels of conflict and increasingly protracted crises and protracted conflicts. And we're also, some of us, are very aware and quite keenly aware of the shifting terrain around social protection, welfare, moving away from rights and vulnerability back into a growth, employment, jobs agenda. That's becoming very apparent, even though it seems to take us back 20 years. So, for example, promoting economic growth and employment are key objectives at the moment for the World Bank in their social protection outlook. Following recent reductions in aid by US and other European countries, we're just seeing that there's this push on how to justify any interventions around social protection in terms of growth and employment. But obviously in protracted crisis situations where needs are very high and programming is very overstretched, it can be very difficult to support livelihoods. So we're trying to think about how do we get that balance between protecting lives and promoting livelihoods in contexts where you've got protracted crises. So in this session, we're really keen to think about how the gains made through social protection over the last 20 years can be protected, particularly when you get sort of acute crises and then protracted happening on sort of more stable places. So we're going to look into that. We're going to delve into it. So we've got 4 experts on the subject here. I'm going to introduce them. We've got Jeremy Lin, you will know, who is a professor a research fellow at IDS. He's also the co-research director of the BASIC program. And he's a geographer by training. And he's worked on themes of conflict, violence, livelihoods, and social protection, often in pastoralist areas. So you're welcome. We have Paul Quarles van Ufford. Have I said that right? It's a difficult surname. Oh, that's why I can say it's Paul. But then...
Originates in England.
Yes. Okay. So anyway, he's a regional advisor, social policy advisor for UNICEF in Western Central Africa. And he provides oversight and guidance to UNICEF for their social policy teams in the region. And his fields of work include social protection, child poverty, public finance management, and local governance. He's worked in a number of countries across the globe, so you're welcome. Also, then your word? Oh, another geographer. Oh. Okay. Then we have Federico Spano, who is from the FAO, and I've worked with some time ago, even co-published. He is a social policy specialist with a lot of experience working across humanitarian development nexus in countries including Afghanistan, Venezuela, Brazil, Somalia, and the Philippines. He's been working with FAO since 2015, and he's recently joined the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. Welcome. And then we have Susanne Jaspars. And Susanne is a senior research fellow at SOAS, Food Studies Center, and researches the political dynamics of food migration in situations of conflict, food, and humanitarian crises. She's the principal investigator of a big project studying the political economy as well as food insecurity and how that affects of digitizing food assistance. So great. how this session is going to run, ideally, we're going to make it quite interactive. If you guys are up for that, you can question each other as well. So we'll probably have half an hour of us, and then we'll open it up to the floor. Okay, so if you're droning on, I will hold this up 1 minute and then a 0 minute. Okay. So we want to keep people engaged. So I'm going to ask one question. We'll take a first round, and then I'll come with another related question, and we'll sort of take it from there and see how it goes. So with growth and employment, once again, featuring strongly in aid discourses and in social protection discourses, I'd like to ask you each to reflect on what are realistic objectives for programming in regard to promoting livelihoods. So thinking about that more promotive resilience agenda. What can we actually, are there any best case? What do we do with that? So let's start, yes, with Jeremy. Why don't you?
Oops. Sorry, yeah. So thank you, Rachel, for that introduction, and really nice to be here on a panel where geographers are dominating a little bit. That's doesn't always happen that way. Right, so big question, and an urgent question as well, I think, given the moment we're in. And obviously, the question sort of begs the current situation of huge reductions in aid globally, and the need for social protection to make its case. And especially as Rachel, as you said, the World Bank is by far the largest financier of social protection in fragile and conflict-affected countries, and is prioritizing growth and jobs, then it's imperative for those of us advocating for social protection to make its case. But I would like to begin by unpacking what we might mean by livelihoods and growth, which is especially important for crisis-affected places. So I'll ask a question. Is supporting livelihoods providing protection for highly vulnerable populations in crises, where many continue to live with conflict-related insecurities, disrupted or altogether absent essential public services, and legal uncertainty for certain displaced and other minority groups? Or is it something beyond this? Asset transfers, skills training, extension services, and so forth, all of which are intended not only to support a baseline of survival and coping, but also to nurture adaptive capacities for people to adjust their livelihoods and thrive. And so I ask this because dominant aid discourses seem to equate supporting livelihoods with the latter, with building adaptive capacities to thrive. That protecting households, supporting their abilities to absorb or be buffered against enduring stressors that characterize crises, is not enough. That it sits outside or separately a program that supports livelihoods. And this is also the strong emphasis of some governments in protracted crisis countries that don't want so-called handouts or dependency, that they want economic growth and they want jobs. So I'm uncomfortable with this seeming hiving off of protection from what is considered to be supporting livelihoods, especially in protracted crisis settings. I think that this is misleading and wrong, that in crises where predatory practices, discriminatory regimes, and ongoing violence might all exist in various combinations, that social protection can and does support livelihoods and growth through its core function of protecting vulnerable households and individuals. Absorptive capacities are foundational for adaptive capacities. Strengthening these during conflict is important in turn for strengthening livelihoods when conditions permit. And so I'll finish here in a moment. So in settings where there is a lower, what you might call a baseline and where violence continues to drive vulnerability, supporting livelihoods might involve rebuilding people's capacities to manage risk at a very basic level, and strengthening absorptive capacities may be all that is possible. And there's plenty of evidence over the years of how social protection does exactly this, how it contributes to food security, when they can make small investments in reciprocal social relations, that those who receive social protection bounce back more quickly than non-beneficiaries when conditions improve. So social protection in crises manages heightened levels of vulnerability in ways that support wider ambitions to accelerate recovery and growth when conditions allow. Without social protection, stronger livelihoods and growth in crises becomes harder to reach and possibly adds to future humanitarian burdens.
Great, thank you. Interesting how you're saying, you don't want to separate that protective and adaptive function, because that protective function essentially builds is the basis for building resilience. So we can take that forward. But something I was reminded of while you were talking was for those of you who know the adaptive social protection framework that very much came out of Chris Benet's and other work, there is an assumption, and it's actually become a huge World Bank agenda, very different agenda than it was originally planned to be. But the assumption originally was that the system would require stability for you to have adaptive capacities. Now, that's kind of an interesting phenomenon when we think about crises and protracted crises. So I wonder if we could look into that a bit as we go forward. Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And thanks for the opportunity to be on the panel. I think we can now safely say that geographers think alike. What I wanted to say is very complementary to what you said, Jeremy. A few points. When we talk about expectations for social protection, from my experience, which is largely based on Africa and Sahel in particular, I think that even in stable settings, we have significantly increased over the years our expectations from social protection interventions. The terms like economic inclusion, productive inclusion, financial inclusion, jobs, growth, local economies, they've all come to be part of results frameworks for social protection programs. And I think that is also why we have seen a proliferation of cash plus approaches, attempts to optimize the impacts of the basic interventions and bring them closer to those very ambitious outcomes. And in my experience, everywhere on the continent, even in stable settings, we have faced capacity constraints. Models have worked out in pilot settings, but their external validity was very low. We didn't manage to bring them to scale everywhere. When we evaluated those cash plus interventions, the evidence was not conclusive everywhere. And sometimes also I've seen the tendency then to be very negative about the entire intervention, including the basic component of social assistance. So I think we should keep in mind that those bigger outcomes, it's a bit of a risk to put these in the basket of social protection objectives, and social protection is always part of a broader set of socioeconomic development interventions and economic environment. Now, in a crisis settings, then moving to the Sahel, where I want to focus on, there's not an exception. Most of the governments in the Sahel, they want jobs. And we understand why they want that, because there are no jobs. And the challenges these countries face, now they demand jobs for young people, for stability, etc. We understand that narrative. But we also see that it has translated in a change the way these governments perceive social assistance programs. Safety net programs in some countries have become productive safety net programs. Under the influence of shock responsive social protection or adaptive social protection narratives, cycles have been shortened. Shock responsive social protection has put an emphasis on one-off payments after a shock or just a few payments. And increasingly, I hear from governments that we can do promotion, economic inclusion, productive inclusion, jobs, without the protective component, without regular, predictable, multi-year cash transfers. And I think the narratives had the terminology that we have contributed around shock responsive and adaptive social protection have also contributed to some of that, what I would call confusion. And I think we know that it is incredibly difficult to do livelihood promotion without a protective component. And in a crisis setting, it is even difficult to do it with a protective component. People have time constraints. They have stress. They need to protect their human capital. There are other competing priorities. Delivery is a challenge. Activities on financial literacy training, extension services, people have moved out. It is very difficult to implement these livelihood promotion packages, and it is very costly. It is very costly, so we're looking at the trade-off between more people with protective support versus the very comprehensive packages.
Great.
I'll stop here. A few more points, but later.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. So you're sort of raising the whole issue around cash plus, promotive, it's complicated. Federico, I know you've been looking quite a bit at these sorts of things, adaptive, cash plus, so over to you.
Yeah. I mean, Paul has been raising a few of the points I wanted to raise, so it'll be easier for me. I'll just try to make it a little bit more ag specific, maybe. So going back to your question, I think that to promote employment and livelihood promotion in fragile settings, it's extremely difficult. And in order to be successful, we have to be for sure be aware that we cannot leave aside the protective function of SP. But also, I think we have to be honest on a number of things. The first one is who we want to target and how we go about targeting and selecting beneficiaries for this specific subsection of social protection programs, because we always find ourselves looking into an overwhelming amount of needs. But if we, for instance, create a scoring system for a program that wants to do lively promotion and employment, and we create a scoring system that is going to promote maybe single-headed households, people with disability, and multiple kids in the households, potentially we can have very good impact on food security and nutrition, but maybe not as good impact in terms of employability and livelihood promotion. So what I'm trying, my first point would be probably right program for the right people in a constellation of programs that address different needs. A second thing where we have to think, I mean, profoundly, I think, and be honest, is the operational capacity of government or non-state actors which are implementing this program in fragile settings. Because, for instance, if we intervene in a rural areas where the main livelihood is agriculture, and we design a lean season cash for work of cash for training programs that is supposed to provide access to income during the lean season, and then we drag it along the planting season, then this is going to come at the cost of failing in agricultural crop yields. And this happen quite often, unfortunately. I think the last point where we have to think well and be honest is what Paul was mentioning before, which is to what extent we can load social protection employment program with expectations, win-win-win-win solutions, and multiple objectives, right? What I often see are programs that, at the very least, they want to have an impact on resilience, climate, and income, and sometimes adding a few other things. So I think if we want to have a cash plus program that has an impact on nutrition, for instance, the best option for agricultural practices could be promote legumes crops. So we can tick also the climate box, but maybe in a fragile settings, we cannot do that, and we have to resort to livestock. And even if we consider livestock maybe the best option for the beneficiaries might be goats, to be the plus component of the cash transfer, but maybe because of the need of a short cycle of production, we have to resort to poultry. So these are the kind of difficult decisions that we have to make sometimes. And I think that often we are not very good at making difficult decisions. Plus, there are some decisions that cannot be made because of the social cohesion element, but maybe I'll leave that for later.
Leave that. You're taking away the next question from me. But Susanne, over to you. I think maybe you might help us problematize resilience as a concept in itself.
Right, I will do my best, but I want to say a couple of things before that. Yeah, so I work in places like Sudan and Somalia, and mostly from kind of politics, humanitarian, and food studies perspective. So that's where I'm coming from. So I think in crisis affected countries, we really need to recognize that we're talking about mostly very unequal societies, and that crises are always provide ways of making money. So there's always people who benefit, like thinking about David Keene's work on the benefits of famine. So in most cases, I think what we're talking about is kind of supporting survival for the majority, and I don't know, maybe kind of making sure that the elite doesn't make too much of a profit, or at least doesn't exploit others. So I've been looking at, as Rachel said, digitalizing food systems in Sudan and looking at the politics of that. And the use of mobile money transfers has been highly beneficial because it can deliver assistance to areas where populations can't be reached otherwise. So obviously that's something to build on. There's drawbacks, there's exclusions. Some people don't have bank accounts, some people don't have access to internet. And these are often the poorest and most marginalized populations. So we must also be aware of not kind of feeding into these inequalities. Especially if we're working together with kind of private sector entities like telecommunications companies and financial service providers. So one realistic objective would be to make sure that people have access to the assistance, which is not very exciting, but that would include maybe even a little bit of a range, like cash for basic needs or even cash for recovery. For example, my colleague Tamara and I were talking about what's needed now in Khartoum for people to return. There's massive cleanup operations needed, so public works projects would work there. We've also heard about some cash for livelihoods projects, which are working and allowing women to set up kind of small businesses. But the second point I want to make is about resilience, and especially resilience objectives. And when you look at kind of cash, food, nutrition, there's often a link made between social protection and resilience. And it could be linking, cash or food with agricultural infrastructure building, or with behavior change, or just to make people stronger so they can withstand shocks. But the key here is that, it's a focus on the individual nutrition or food security without addressing causes, which of course is difficult. It depoliticizes, but also it expects, we talked about adaptation, expects populations to accept living a life of permanent exposure to danger and violence. And this is what I'm most concerned about. I mean, it's like provide this kind of, the resilience approach is just, it's in one way it's a necessity, but in other ways we must make sure that we don't forget that it isn't addressing causes, and that it is people, in a way, expecting people to adapt to a life of permanent crisis is not actually what we should be aiming for. So I was actually also discussing this question with a colleague from ICRC, and he says there can't be any acceptance of resilience to violations of humanitarian law or of human rights. So I think, again, when we're talking about conflict, this is important to remember. So then I started thinking about, way back I did a project at ODI on livelihoods and protection linkages. So here, when we're talking about kind of serious human rights abuses, can we link livelihoods with actual protection, as in minimizing risks to safety or keeping people safe? And that would require things like, finding a way to reporting to UN Security Council at the very highest level, or with the warring parties through whichever kind of entity, but also more kind of simply just providing livelihoods assistance to keep people safe, rather than any other, as well as meeting other needs. I think I'll leave it at that.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. And thank you for raising those issues that are much more difficult to deal with in terms of protection, and the the types of outcomes we want to see that we wouldn't necessarily see in a stable type setting. So that moves me on to the next question, which you don't all have to answer. We're just going to see who would like to answer it. We were talking about cash plus. Often within social protection, we talk about pluses being fertilizers and sheep and beekeeping and training and all sorts of things. But, you know, myself and colleagues did a big review of cash plus programs in protracted crisis settings, and clearly the pluses don't really seem fit for those contexts, because often if people have had to migrate or been displaced, not much point giving them a goat, you know what I mean? So it's like, well, maybe those pluses should be more, and this is a question, should we be thinking more about social cohesion, building state capacity, building the social contract? What does that mean? How can we look at those pluses in a different way within these settings, and maybe stop thinking about how we work only sort of in crisis, but how do we work on crisis? How do we deal with those fundamental issues that are keeping people in situations of protracted shock? You know, they're constantly having to face shocks. So can we think a little bit more broadly outside the box in terms of the types of programming we're providing? So who would like to take a first shot on that? And even if you want to ask each other questions. And then we'll open up to the floor after that. Go on, guys. Who's going to go first? Paul.
Just to give it a start, because I recently also thought that social cohesion is perhaps another very high level outcome that we add to the basket of social protection objectives. And I was wondering which concrete sort of plus activity would be the social cohesion activity. I think to start with, it is incredibly critical that we understand the pathways through which social protection interventions affect social cohesion. And that can be through the design of programs, but in particular, I think it can be through the implementation of programs. The way we organize targeting mechanisms, the way we communicate about program objectives, the way we organize feedback mechanisms. It is very critical, I believe, to monitor that and to understand in what ways that affects positively or negatively social cohesion. I think a key objective for social protection programs should be at least to do no harm to social cohesion by having a good understanding of the potential impact, eligibility criteria, etc., and implementation mechanisms, and to have a focus on the continuation and no disruption of services to people. And the debate on how social protection program objectives can have a social cohesion component, I'm reflecting on it. I don't have a good suggestion.
Yeah. Susanne?
Please.
Thank you. Yes, I'm not sure whether it links to Cash Plus, but I want to say a little bit about social protection and peace building, or war, and social cohesion. The first thing I want to talk about is the Sudan Family Support Program, or the Thamarat, that was implemented during the revolutionary transitional government. And in one sense, I mean, it was supposed to, it was implemented, it was supposed to mitigate the impact of neoliberal policies of reducing subsidies, of floating the Sudanese pound on the international market, basically kind of World Bank, IMF induced policies. But what it actually did is it reshaped the state in favor of international actors, and whereas revolutionaries were actually calling for the state to take on more responsibilities for its citizens. And in the end, I mean, and I'm hoping my colleague Tamara will talk about this more, it couldn't even provide the cash that was promised, and it kind of eroded the legitimacy of the post-revolution government, and thereby, in some sense, contributed to the coup and ultimately the war. And the reason I mentioned this is because, you know, well, again, Cash Plus is very individual level, but I mean, here we're talking at a very bigger scale, how, you know, the limitations of what social protection can do, and also if, yeah, what kind of high expectations do if those aren't met, and they are very, very serious, and many people in Sudan are very, very angry about this. So that's one thing. And then about social cohesion, I wanted to talk, I mean, we've talked a lot about the emergency response rooms and the community response and civil society responding to crisis, and how these informal mechanisms is the way forward. And just to say that we really shouldn't over romanticize this. I mean, we've heard various issues in relation to that, but I want to talk particularly about, for example, in the Sudanese community, at the kind of the stress and the pressure and the trauma it is giving to them to provide that form of assistance and to have that responsibility, because no one else is responding to the crisis. Well, people try, but I mean, no one else is responding to the level that's needed. So I really want to discourage us from kind of normalizing, you know, the response via kind of frontline workers or local responders. We can't just leave them to take care of themselves.
Thank you. That's quite provocative. I'm hoping people are going to come forward in a minute. So did you want to say something?
Thanks. So as you know, I mean, we recently wrote a paper on this topic, it's like social protection, sustaining peace and social protection. And one of the things that we mentioned is that social protection programs can build a compact between the state and its citizens if assistance is delivered equitably and transparently, or better, if there is a perception by the citizen that this is happening. Now, how often does this happen? Not very often. So as I also was saying, I mean, I wouldn't try to give this additional responsibility of social protection to deliver peace outcomes, but rather really try to focus our work in fragile settings to always have a conflict-sensitive approach when we decide social protection program, because the level of damages that we can make, it's quite important. Yesterday, you made a very good example about school feeding, I think, right? School feeding is the typical social protection measure that can create social cohesion and even actually have a very positive impact on local agricultural livelihoods, but also can be very problematic. Now, the difference between school feeding that is bringing rice from abroad and killing the local market, or an homegrown school feeding approach that is mobilizing, bringing the community together, it's huge. We've been looking at few examples where also social protection has been used instrumentally to address the conflict, the consequence of conflict, like the Pacificação process in Brazil, the similar process for the FARC fight in Colombia. But I think one of the most interesting examples that we came across was Timor-Leste, where the veteran scheme after the 2002 war against Indonesia is absorbing around 70 to 80% of the social protection budget. So, I mean, with the intention of addressing the consequence of a conflict, this scheme now is creating an intergenerational social tension between that generation and the younger generation that they have deprived from resources. So.
One of the places that basic research has looked at closely is Ethiopia and the Productive Safety Net program. And the evidence in Ethiopia, and this is one of the most studied social protection programs, so there's a lot of evidence. And the evidence has said that the PSNP has contributed to something greater beyond sort of core protective elements when there has been functioning complementary programming. And I think this is the difficulty with crises, is that the sort of the state infrastructural power for improving livelihoods, for something more productive, diminishes. There's obviously a lot of state infrastructural power around creating violence, so the resources are directed elsewhere. So the capacity then to connect social protection with a wider spectrum of interventions is often just that much more difficult, whether it's peace or something else, because everything is overstretched. Health is overstretched, education is overstretched. Everyone is struggling with the same pressures. And just as sort of a final thought, there was an excellent presentation at the conference this morning on Colombia, and social protection was an explicit part of an offer on peace in following the 2016 peace agreement there. But yet it's had disappointing results. And I think the language that Ignacio, who presented that great work, said was that it was sort of a glue, social protection you might sort of look at as a glue. I found that really striking because we all are sort of interacting with social protection as a carved out, standalone, discrete sector, rather than as something that is sort of, I don't know, more interactive, sort of more networked. And so I'm just wondering if there's a challenge for us as well, working in the sector and trying to perfect the technical proficiency and implementation, if we've lost sight of something, and that we need to think about how it's a glue is all important to how it might be effective for peace and other things.
Great. Okay. Well, we have about 25 minutes to discuss this. I'm going to take questions. I've got some hands up already. We'll take about 4 or 5 and then we'll do another round. So yeah, Peter's, and then back to you, and then we'll come back to you.
So the question is to Federico and Susanne, and I want to focus a bit on the rural-urban dynamic here around social protection. When it comes to displacement and human mobility, there seems to be this inevitable urbanization that we seem to completely accept. And although I'm not a big sort of fan of the 3 durable solution and return being the most important one, we seem to be giving up on that potential for people who have come from a rural background, come to the cities during conflict or as a result of climate change, to ever go back to a rural existence. So I can understand when it comes to pastoralists, of course, people lose their stocks during the conflict. They go to cities, and nobody's ever going to give them, these animals again. And in reality, of course, there is a trend towards sort of larger labor, extensive livestock. Now, a concrete question: are the current social protection systems and mechanisms, are they really adapted to this reality? And are we really giving up on promoting, maintaining people or returning people to rural livelihoods? Or is there something that can be done? And I'm sure, there are within FAO, there are ideas around that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I could just go back, Becky.
Hi, my name is Bara Hunzai. I just wanted to speak to, make a suggestion on the question you asked about what could the cash pluses be. I wonder, it's a very complicated question, but there is also some simplified provisions that I think we might all agree with, which is like sanitary napkins for women. I don't know why we don't do that enough as a basic right, because it acts as such a huge barrier. It leads to so much infection and disease. And, a woman, before she needs cash, she needs that. So I just wonder if we could at least agree on some very basic pluses that might be more straightforward.
Thank you. We've got a question down here.
Thank you so much, the panelists and Rachel. So given the theme of the panel is how social protection can contribute for growth and livelihood, I would like to ask, because in recent years, there are quite a lot of, I would say, innovative ideas around social protection. One being prearranged finance, insurance have been like coming at the forefront, and there is a huge attraction from the financer as well as from the recipient side. And Jeremy, you rightly put PSNP in Ethiopia. In recent years, I remember the World Food Program was blending PSNP with that of insurance. So my question is that where do you see the private sector in this whole set of narratives around innovation, sustainability, and scalability of social protection, both for growth and livelihood? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's just take one more, Philip, and then we'll come back, and then we'll come over to this side to get some hands.
Hi, Philip Bradford, IDS. My question is around social cohesion, and it's how do you convince governments that what they want is social cohesion? Because the discussion around localization, that Susanne was saying that we shouldn't overly valorize it, etc. Well, you know, in the Arab world, the interest, there's a tradition of state building as a local tradition through the Arab nationalist period, the building of institutions. This is also a local tradition that we neglect, but that was not necessarily done because they wanted social cohesion. It was potentially done, or it was largely done, because they wanted to weaken the power of the feudal elite by building a national state body. They had different objectives in mind. So if we're saying social cohesion is the objective, why would a nation state government necessarily want that? Maybe they want one population that's more exploitable and going to be removed. Why do they want them to feel happy and content in this country?
That's a good point. Right, we will take some responses and then we'll go to online actually, and then we'll come over here. So yes, got 4 questions. Who would like to kick off? Susanne, do you want to talk about why governments would even want social cohesion? Just an easy one.
Can I try and answer some of the others first? I actually wanted to respond to the first question and also the third question. I'll be very brief. The first question, accepting urbanization, I think what I've seen in my research on migration is that it is usually kind of families split. And I mean, I'm sure people know this here, is that, you know, now, for example, in Sudan, you will have, you know, somebody back in the village. Actually, this was before the war, somebody in Khartoum, somebody in Saudi, somebody in the UK. So you have this kind of transnational livelihoods these days. And I think, so maybe this, and it kind of becomes an informal form of social protection because, you know, the people in Saudi and the people in the UK or somewhere else, they end up supporting family back home, and maybe that's even the aim. And then one of the but of course, what's interesting there is that you know, migration, especially to Europe, is maybe one of the most effective things in terms of resilience, but that's not allowed. I mean, you have to be resilient, but you have to stay where you are. So that's another thing. But I mean, I think the support of kind of transnational livelihoods and the flow of money through those is a very important aspect. And rather the private sector, it's already there, you know, it is completely part of social protection in that, you know, the financial service providers are usually private sector, data management organizations. Yeah, I mean, probably others. On social cohesion, oh God, I mean, how to come together? I don't know. I mean, let somebody else try it. I mean, it's maybe that's why it's not, but that's why, I don't know, people have to rely more on informal social networks because governments don't actually want it. I don't know. You go.
Any other responses from you both?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly on the question of, are we giving up on promotion? I think in some cases we're rushing into it prematurely. And I remember a study we did years ago at IDS in around 2011-12 with FAO and others in Darfur. And at that time, there was a split between the humanitarian development community and this push for the durable solutions. And the Sudanese state at that point was saying, oh, well, people should go back to the rural areas and there should be return policy now, and they should start rebuilding their livelihoods in spite of continuing violence, in spite of other groups having settled on their land. And the list went on and on. There was no protection or security yet. So I think actually international actors, through their fatigue and exhaustion with these situations, want to say, okay, it's done. Yeah, let's move on with your lives prematurely when actually protection needs are still very significant.
If anyone wants one more, it's just I'd quite like to go online as well and collect. You can keep ruminating on these things. I think we should take a few online in case some of the things come up. Is that okay? Let's. Do you want to read who's reading out?
So we have 4 questions and a comment online. The first question is not directed at anyone, but I think maybe probably Federico. As a social protection practitioner, an anonymous person says, as a social protection practitioner in a fragile setting, Haiti, I notice we approached it from a technical perspective when decision makers approach social protection from a political perspective. For instance, targeting, which is inherently political for governments. How can we grapple with our current political climate, which is moving away from the idea of the welfare state? As practitioners, how do we advocate for social protection? That's the first one. Do you want me to read the one more? Well, I can do 2 more. One is from Tama. Tama asks, social protection, whose responsibility? State, market, INGOs, donors, local communities? That's for anyone that wants to answer it. And then Nadia asks Susanne, I would welcome, if possible, for her to elaborate on the family support programs collapse, the key reasons for it, and the impact on peace. There is more if we have time.
That's great. That's great. Anyone want to come back on any of those straight away? Yeah?
I'm not sure that was for me, but I'll take it. As this is an easy one. So I think this speaks a little bit to the colleague from IDS was saying yesterday, about making social protection more political also within the Western world. And I agree. I think we should do that as a practitioner. We should make a case of why this is important, right? We cannot expect donor to make an unpopular decision, while we should also try to convince the public in the Western world about the importance of investing in social protection. Specifically on targeting, one of the points I was making before was exactly around this, not in Haiti, but in Afghanistan, where we struggle to do any type of prioritization in terms of targeting within areas and villages, right? Because everyone is in need and there is a big issue about redistribution. And sometimes you just have to accept that. And we know that maybe technically that's not fine because the level of transfer is going to be lower than is going to have a significant impact, but we cannot, again, thinking about social cohesion, create tension because we want to give $11 instead of $6 to each one in one specific village. I wanted to go about the one on rural-urban migration because I think that's an existential question, in my opinion. And I do not want to represent the FAO in this, but in my opinion, we do have to find ways to make agriculture and rural areas more attractive. This being through social protection, but also through other investments in the agricultural area, because I mean, that's where the food is coming from, right? We published a study a few years back where in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, up to 75% of the food consumed by poor and ultra poor is coming from small-scale food producers. So if these people stop producing, we're just going to get in a cycle of destitution constantly. So it's not going to be easy for sure, but I mean, that's the direction where I will keep investing when you have the security to go there and when you have other sectors, namely agriculture, that is willing to also invest in making these professional or area more investments, more, interesting.
I can say something about.
Yeah, if you just briefly able to say something about the family support program.
And if someone else can answer the question about whose responsibility is social protection, that would be good. Yes, I don't know what more I can say. I mean, it was a large kind of World Bank and other international donor funded project started, after really positive time in Sudan, the revolution, the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir, and hopes for a kind of civilian government. So at that time, it was a transitional government. And it was also, for like 20 years, Sudan had been dependent, not dependent, but international aid had been mainly humanitarian aid. So it was the first time that kind of World Bank loans became a possibility again, but the condition of that was to kind of remove the state subsidies. And because it was because it is an untargeted form of aid, but anyway, it was always any cutting on subsidy has always kind of immediately led to kind of mass demonstrations and protests. But anyway, to mitigate that, the idea was to have this social protection program for about 80% of the population and giving like $5 per person per month. And even the Prime Minister at times said, well, it's just a gesture. But it wasn't, yeah, I mean, it wasn't, it's hardly implemented. I mean, I can't remember the figures, but only a tiny proportion of it was done. And the thing is that the kind of, I guess the legitimacy of the kind of post-revolution government is really rested on, you know, I mean, it just kind of, the economic crisis just became too severe for that government to last. And that kind of gave an incentive for the kind of the military coup. And I mean, after the military coup, World Bank funding stopped. So, I mean, and the program stopped. So that was how it collapsed. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a couple more questions. I know we've still got the question, whose responsibility is it? I think in multiple discussions we've had, I mean, I think most of us would say it's the state's responsibility, but where the state is not able or not willing, then other actors have to step in. And we've had lots of discussions around which actors they should be, including global actors. But let's take a couple more. And they don't have to be questions. They could be responses to questions that have already been raised. Vincent and Victor and Andrew, and then the hand at the back. Thank you.
I want to have a very vibrant discussion with Susanne, but we'll do that later. On the social cohesion question, I do believe that social protection is part of a social contract, right? It is the norms that the state and the society have established for what is deemed as a fair redistributive mechanism between the state and its people, right? And I think as a consequence of that, there is always some sort of link between any type of social protection intervention and how the state is perceived, whether it's a vertical relationship of cohesion or how scarce resources are divided at, you know, in groups or out groups at the horizontal level, right? So just because we haven't done enough research or tested it enough, right, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think IDS has been working with WFP on school feeding and seeing what the 7 or 8 pathways are in which it can be done, and testing that in Mali and in Somalia. And I think Carol has been also working with Paul, yourself, and the team in the Sahel on the specific ways in which the twin track approach and the Sahel Adaptive Program are doing that. So I think the pathways are there. The question of why would a government want to do that? Yes, right. It depends very much on the objectives of the government. But in the case of Somalia and the National Development Plan, they very clearly say the social assistance program is strengthening a positive vision of a federal model of Somalia in a time that we're contesting the subnational level like Puntland or Somaliland, right? So even though they don't have clear pathways, they do believe in the idea of delivery of the state as being a clear driver of that. But the final thing, and I won't go into many of the other issues, is the geopolitics of it, right? You want to attract international finance. You want to be a credit-worthy partner. You don't want to have debts. You want to have concessionary loans and potentially foreign investment. So if the World Bank and IMF tell you, well, you need to have a social safety net that does A, B, and C, or you won't get the billions of dollars or, you know, the IMF credit facilities, right? There is also a geopolitical element of that otherwise you just don't have money to do anything, right? So it's very, very complex.
Thank you. Victor, if you can just keep them brief, but I mean, we can carry on, but the live stream will go off soon, but Victor.
All right, just brief. My fear is we're running away from social cohesion, but 2 things. What aspects, what actually do we want to know about in terms of the linkage between social protection and social cohesion? Is it the bonding? Is it the bridging? Or is it the dimensions? Because my experience is that even social protection doesn't guarantee state legitimacy. Social protection does not guarantee legitimacy of the government in the eyes of the people. Particularly because something we are also missing as we talk about fragile and conflict-affected areas is we've forgotten that there are deep fault lines in these societies. Fault lines that where the root causes of the fragility itself. So, and you say you want to build social cohesion. Why I'm raising this is that I've seen a number of projects now, and everybody's saying social cohesion as that I ask myself, in a context which has deep and heavy fault lines that are historical, religious, cultural, political, economic, what do you want to do with cohesion?
Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you. Well, I think mine follows very closely from that. I was going to talk about social cohesion being a very valuable perspective to bring to discussions on social protection, because it relates to the causes of conflict, the underlying fault lines, and it brings back a wider development agenda with social protection potentially in its place, rather than being the magic bullet to solve all the problems. And I mean, this may be obvious to say, but just thinking about the Sudan, the current war in the Sudan is one of a long series of wars. I mean, Sudan has been at war with itself more for longer than it's been at peace over, you know, the last 100 years probably. And these struggles have got underlying economic and social causes around structural inequalities. And, you know, sort of reflecting a bit on you know, taking off from where Susanne was talking about Sudan. And I think if social protection is to contribute to greater social cohesion, you need to think about a wider range of policies, interventions, markets, and the functioning of markets and the inequalities that are generated. So in the Sudan, for example, you know, the big tensions between the riverine communities and the more peripheral communities over crop markets. The market for sesame creates massive inequalities in which the farmers producing the sesame don't actually get very much, or it's highly vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera. Just one little example of, you know, the many areas where inequalities can be generated, and the relationships between the groups which then come into conflict with each other are determined. Structure of labor markets is also, you know, really important in that. Distribution of infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, one could go on, but there's a very big agenda there. And I think social protection needs to be seen in its place within that much broader agenda, which is not to devalue social protection, has tremendous potential. I think we know all that, but we do need that wider agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We had two more hands. There were two back. Did anyone have a hand up there? That we've got time perhaps for just to, okay, Julie and then Tahira.
Hi, I just wanted to ask to what extent you think that quite a lot of the so-called resilience programming that we're seeing coming out, which often has a graduation or transition label put on it, it often feels to me as if it's not a genuine attempt to improve rural livelihoods or to invest in rural livelihoods, but it's really more of a myth that we're telling an increasingly right-wing political leadership in order to try and carry on with funding in very difficult contexts where we've been, you know, spending humanitarian money for decades, and we're saying, yes, we can do it differently. This is how, but it is deeply unrealistic given the challenges of those environments.
Just one last comment. I'm not going to be taking responses from us again. I'll wrap up after your comment. So leave us on a great comment.
Comment, not question?
Whatever you prefer.
Okay, question. Linked to resilience building and protecting livelihood and considering the global aid cuts and debt crisis, what is the future of social protection in the drylands, mostly dominated by pastoralists, not necessarily in active violent conflict, but grappling with multiple intersecting crises, including floods, drought, disease, and raiding? Can social protection and cash plus support feed and fodder, improve breed, or offtake and restocking, and like, is giving cash enough, or all these sectors that I mentioned? Thank you.
That sounds like an essay of a question to me. And I think Jeremy would love to answer that over the coffee break. So you should get him. But I think that's been a very great session. It's thrown up more questions than answers, as usual. Well, not as usual. This one is particularly tricky, I think. So I'm really grateful for all your input. This will be an ongoing conversation. Yes, very difficult indeed. And thank you so much for those who have been online. Thank you for your participation. So we'll end the live stream now. But before you go for coffee, I'm going to make an announcement. So a clap for all the panelists.